When millionaire Harold Blackstone saw a familiar golden necklace around a waitress's neck, his world crumbled. That necklace held his darkest secret, one that could destroy everything he'd built. The crystal chandeliers of Grandview Manor cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as Harold Blackstone adjusted his silk tie for the third time that evening. The exclusive restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of the city's elite, their designer jewelry catching the warm light like scattered stars. Harold had built an empire from nothing, transforming abandoned buildings into luxury hotels that now graced 3 continents. Yet tonight, something felt different. "Your usual table, Mr. Blackstone?" Marcus, the maitre d', approached with practiced elegance. Harold nodded, following the familiar path through the dining room where senators dined alongside tech moguls and oil executives. This was his sanctuary, his reward after decades of 18-hour days and countless sacrifices. The weight of his success sat heavily on his shoulders, but it was a burden he'd learned to carry with pride. As he settled into his corner booth, Harold's weathered hands traced the rim of his wine glass. 3 years had passed since Margaret's funeral, yet her absence still echoed through every quiet moment. She had been his compass, his conscience, the gentle voice that reminded him there was more to life than quarterly reports and board meetings. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to Grandview Manor." The voice was soft, melodic, carrying a warmth that seemed out of place in this temple of cold luxury. Harold looked up, expecting to see James, his usual server who knew his preferences without asking. Instead, a young woman stood beside his table, her posture straight, despite the exhaustion that flickered in her dark eyes. "I'm Sophia, and I'll be taking care of you tonight," she continued, her smile genuine despite the obvious fatigue weighing on her shoulders. "May I start you with our signature appetizer selection?" Harold studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw, the way she held herself with dignity despite the obvious stress lines around her eyes. There was something achingly familiar about her resilience, a quality he recognized from his own reflection decades ago when he'd been fighting to build something from nothing. "Where's James?" Harold asked, his tone softer than intended. "He called in tonight, sir, but I promise you'll receive the same exceptional service." Sophia's response was professional, but Harold caught the slight tremor in her voice, the way her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the order pad. As Sophia reached across the table to adjust his silverware, Harold's world suddenly tilted on its axis. There, catching the light from the chandelier above, was a pendant that made his breath catch in his throat. The intricate golden design seemed to burn against her skin, its familiar curves and detailed engravings sending shockwaves through his carefully constructed composure. His wine glass slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, the crystal shattering against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the restaurant's gentle ambiance like a gunshot. Conversations paused, heads turned, but Harold saw none of it. His entire focus had narrowed to that impossible piece of jewelry hanging around this stranger's neck. "Sir, are you all right?" Sophia's concern was immediate and genuine, her hand instinctively reaching toward him before she caught herself, professional boundaries reasserting themselves. The pendant swayed gently with her movement, and Harold felt 30 years of carefully buried grief rise up in his chest like a tsunami. The last time he'd seen that necklace, it had been clasped around Margaret's neck as she'd kissed him goodbye that rainy morning. She'd been wearing it when the police had called him to identify her body after the accident that had shattered his world. "Where?" Harold's voice came out as barely a whisper, raw with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "Where did you get that necklace?" Sophia's hand flew to her throat, her fingers instinctively protective of the pendant. Something in Harold's tone, in the haunted look that had replaced his usual composed demeanor, made her take a step back. It was my mother's," she stammered, confusion and a growing unease coloring her words. "She left it to me when she passed." The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade away entirely as Harold stared at this young woman who wore his dead wife's most precious possession. Margaret had never taken off that necklace, had told him countless times that it was the one thing she'd never part with. It had been her grandmother's, passed down through generations of strong women who'd faced impossible odds with unwavering grace. "That's impossible," Harold breathed, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. "That necklace, it was buried with my wife." Sophia's face paled, her own hands now shaking as she touched the pendant that had been her constant companion for years. "Sir, I think there's been some mistake. This belonged to my mother, Elena Martinez. She worked as a housekeeper." The name hit Harold like a physical blow, memories flooding back with devastating clarity. Elena? Quiet, efficient Elena, who had cleaned his penthouse office for years. Elena who had always arrived early and left late, who had never asked for anything beyond her modest salary. Elena who had disappeared without explanation just days after Margaret's funeral. Elena, Harold repeated, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. She worked for Blackstone Industries. You knew my mother?" Sophia's voice was barely audible, hope and fear warring in her expression. Harold's mind raced through the implications, through memories he'd forced himself to forget. Elena had been in the office the day Margaret died, had been cleaning when he'd received that devastating phone call. She'd witnessed his breakdown, had quietly disposed of the flowers he'd thrown against the wall in his grief. And then she'd vanished. As Harold looked into Sophia's eyes that now seemed hauntingly familiar, a terrible understanding began to dawn. The pendant wasn't just similar to Margaret's necklace. It was Margaret's necklace, which meant Eleanor had taken it. But why? And how had this young woman, this hard-working server struggling to make ends meet, come to possess his wife's most treasured possession? "We need to talk," Harold said, his voice carrying a weight that made Sophia's breath catch. "But not here, not like this." Around them, the restaurant had returned to its quiet elegance, but Harold felt as though his entire world had just been turned upside down. 30 years of grief, of carefully maintained composure, of believing he understood his own story, all of it crumbling in the face of a golden pendant and a young woman's frightened eyes. The private dining room at Grandview Manor felt suffocating despite its spacious elegance. Harold had requested the secluded space within minutes of his shocking discovery, his usual composure replaced by an urgency that surprised even him. Sophia stood near the mahogany table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the golden pendant catching the soft lamplight like a beacon of secrets waiting to be unveiled. "Please, sit down." Harold gestured to the chair across from him, his voice gentler than it had been in the main dining room. The raw shock was settling into something deeper, more complex, a mixture of grief, confusion, and an inexplicable need to understand how his carefully ordered world had been built on incomplete truths. Sophia remained standing, her posture defensive yet dignified. "Mr. Blackstone, I don't understand what's happening here. You're saying this necklace belonged to your wife, but my mother gave it to me years ago. She told me it was her grandmother's, passed down through our family." Harold studied her face, noting the determined set of her jaw that reminded him achingly of Margaret. There was strength there, the kind forged through hardship and responsibility. "Your mother, Elena. She worked for my company for several years. She cleaned the executive offices, including mine." "I know." Sophia's voice was barely above a whisper. She always spoke highly of her work there, said it was the best job she'd ever had, that the people treated her with respect. A wave of shame washed over Harold as he realized how little he'd actually known about the woman who had quietly maintained his workspace for years. Elena had been nearly invisible to him, a professional ghost who arrived before dawn and left after sunset, ensuring his world remained pristine and organized. "Tell me about her," Harold said, surprising himself with the request. "Tell me about your mother." Sophia's defensive posture softened slightly as she finally took the offered seat. "She was everything to me. After my father left when I was young, she worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat, cleaning offices at night, working at a laundry during the day, and taking in sewing on weekends. She never complained, never let me see how tired she was." Harold felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest as Sophia continued. "She would come home from your building and tell me stories about the beautiful offices, the important meetings that happened there. She was so proud to be part of something successful, even in a small way." "She never mentioned the necklace?" Harold asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sophia's hand moved instinctively to the pendant. "She gave it to me when she got sick. Terminal cancer. We couldn't afford the treatments that might have helped. She said this necklace was our family's most precious heirloom, that wearing it would keep me strong through whatever challenges life brought. The words hit Harold like physical blows. While he'd been grieving his wife in his penthouse suite, Elena had been fighting for her life in some understaffed public hospital, unable to afford the care that might have saved her. The irony was devastating. His wife had died instantly in a car accident despite having access to the world's best medical care, while Elena had suffered through a slow, painful decline in anonymity. "When did she pass?" Harold asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "About 6 months after she stopped working for your company," Sophia replied, her voice steady despite the pain that flickered across her features. "She never told me why she left. Just said it was time for a change." Harold's mind raced through the timeline. Elena had disappeared just days after Margaret's funeral, when he'd been consumed by grief and barely functional. His assistant had handled the paperwork, had told him the cleaning staff position had been filled by someone else. He'd never questioned it, had been too lost in his own sorrow to consider the lives of those who orbited his world. "Sophia," Harold began, then stopped, struggling with how to voice the terrible suspicion growing in his mind. "This necklace, it's very distinctive. One of a kind, actually. My wife's grandmother had it specially made by a jeweler in Europe." Sophia's eyes flashed with something between anger and fear. "Are you accusing my mother of stealing?" "I'm trying to understand how your mother came to possess something that was supposedly buried with my wife," Harold replied, his voice carefully measured. "I saw Margaret wearing this necklace the morning she died. The funeral director assured me she was wearing it when we laid her to rest." The silence between them stretched taut as Sophia processed his words. Harold watched emotions play across her face, confusion, betrayal, and a growing horror as implications began to dawn. "There has to be an explanation," Sophia said finally, her voice stronger than Harold expected. "My mother was the most honest person I've ever known. She wouldn't take something that didn't belong to her, no matter how desperate our situation became." Harold found himself believing her, recognizing the same integrity in Sophia's voice that he'd once heard in his own mother's words when she'd defended his father's character against neighborhood gossip. Family loyalty ran deep, but there was something more here, a genuine conviction that spoke to Elena's true character. "What if," Harold said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them, "someone gave it to her?" Sophia looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "Margaret was generous. Sometimes impulsively so. She would give away jewelry to women's shelters, donate clothes to families in need. She believed beautiful things should bring joy, not sit unused in jewelry boxes." But even as he spoke the words, Harold knew they didn't ring true. Margaret would never have given away her grandmother's necklace. It held too much sentimental value, too many memories of the strong women who had worn it before her. "Mr. Blackstone," Sophia said quietly, her voice cutting through his internal struggle. "What if there's something about that day, the day your wife died, that you don't know?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Harold felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd never questioned the official account of Margaret's accident, had been too devastated to probe beyond the basic facts. Car skidded on wet pavement, hit a tree, died instantly. Clean, simple, final. But what if it wasn't that simple? What if Elena had been involved somehow, had witnessed something that explained how she'd come to possess Margaret's most precious belonging? "Sophia," Harold said, his voice heavy with a dread he couldn't quite name, "I think we need to find out exactly what happened to your mother during those last days she worked for my company. Because something tells me the truth about this necklace is going to change everything we thought we knew." Outside the private dining room, the restaurant continued its elegant dance of service and luxury, but inside, two strangers found themselves bound together by a mystery that threatened to unravel years of accepted truth and carefully buried secrets. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital buzzed overhead as Harold and Sophia walked through corridors that reeked of disinfectant and broken dreams. Harold hadn't set foot in a public hospital since his childhood, when his own mother had died in a place exactly like this, understaffed, underfunded, and overflowing with people who couldn't afford better care. "Room 247, Sophia said quietly, stopping before a door that looked identical to dozens of others they'd passed. "This is where she spent her final weeks." Harold's throat tightened as he imagined Elena Martinez lying in that sterile room, fighting a battle she couldn't win while he'd been consumed by his own grief just miles away in his penthouse. The weight of his ignorance felt crushing. "Mr. Blackstone!" a voice called from behind them. They turned to see a woman approaching, her scrubs faded but clean, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd seen too much suffering. "I'm Nurse Patricia Williams. Sophia told me you wanted to speak with someone who knew her mother during her time here." Harold nodded, struggling to find his voice. "I'm trying to understand Elena's final days. She worked for my company, and there are some circumstances I need to clarify." Patricia's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Elena was special. Even while fighting cancer, she worried more about everyone else than herself. She'd comfort other patients, help families navigate the system when they couldn't afford advocates. "Did she ever mention why she left her job?" Sophia asked, her hand unconsciously touching the pendant that had started this devastating journey of discovery. Patricia glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "She made me promise never to tell anyone, but Elena was carrying a terrible burden when she arrived here. She kept saying she'd done something that went against everything she believed in, but that she'd had no choice." Harold felt his blood turn to ice. What kind of burden? She was terrified someone would come looking for her. Not for revenge, she said, but because the truth would destroy lives. She made me swear that if anyone ever came asking questions about her final days, I should tell them about the visitor. "What visitor?" Sophia's voice was sharp with sudden fear. Patricia looked directly at Harold, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and accusation. "A man in an expensive suit came to see Elena 3 days before she died. She was heavily medicated, barely conscious most of the time, but when he arrived, she became agitated, kept apologizing, saying she'd tried to return it but couldn't find a way." The hospital corridor seemed to spin around Harold as the implications crashed over him. Someone from his world had found Elena, had known she possessed Margaret's necklace. But who? And why hadn't they reported it to him? "Did you see this man?" Harold managed to ask. Tall, silver hair, walked like he owned the world. He stayed for maybe 10 minutes, then left. Elena was never the same after that visit. She died 3 days later, and honestly, I think she gave up fighting after seeing him. Harold's mind raced through his inner circle, trying to identify who might have tracked Elena down. His assistant, his lawyer, his business partner, his brother-in-law. All of them had access to company records. All of them would have known about Elena's employment. "Patricia," Sophia said urgently, "did my mother say anything else about this man? Anything at all?" The nurse hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. "She asked me to keep this safe, said that if anyone ever came looking for the truth, I should give it to them. I've been carrying it for years, waiting." Sophia's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope, her name written across it in Elena's familiar handwriting. Harold watched as she carefully opened it, revealing a single sheet of paper covered in shaky script. "My dearest Sophia," Sophia read aloud, her voice breaking, "if you're reading this, then someone has finally come looking for answers about the necklace. I need you to know that I never stole it. Mrs. Margaret gave it to me herself, on the day she died, but not in the way you might think." Harold felt the world tilt dangerously as Sophia continued reading. "I was cleaning the penthouse office that morning when she called, crying and desperate. She begged me to meet her at the old warehouse district, said she had discovered something terrible about her husband's business and needed help. When I found her, she was terrified, saying people were watching her, that her life was in danger." The letter slipped from Sophia's fingers as she stared at Harold in horror. "This can't be true. You're saying my mother met with your wife on the day she died?" Harold's voice came out as a broken whisper. "Margaret was supposed to be shopping that day. She was going to pick up flowers for our anniversary dinner." Patricia stepped forward, her professional demeanor cracking as she witnessed the devastating revelation unfolding before her. "There's more to the letter. Sophia, you need to finish reading it." With shaking hands, Sophia retrieved the paper and continued. "Margaret pressed the necklace into my hands and made me promise to keep it safe until she could reclaim it. She said it contained evidence that could send powerful people to prison, but that she needed time to figure out how to expose the truth without destroying innocent lives. She begged me never to tell anyone, especially her husband, because she wasn't sure who she could trust. The hospital corridor fell silent, except for the distant sounds of medical equipment and muffled conversations. Harold felt 30 years of his life crashing down around him as the implications became clear. Margaret hadn't died in a random accident. She'd been investigating something, had discovered secrets dangerous enough to cost her life. "But that's impossible," Harold said, his voice hollow. Margaret's accident was investigated. The police said she lost control on a wet road. Sophia's eyes burned with a mixture of grief and fury as she read the final lines of her mother's letter. "She never made it back to her car that day, Mr. Blackstone. According to my mother, Margaret was murdered in that warehouse, and someone made it look like an accident afterward." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, transforming everything Harold thought he knew about his wife's final day. Margaret hadn't been the victim of random tragedy. She'd been silenced because of something she'd discovered about his own business empire. "Elena spent 3 years carrying this secret," Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger. "She watched you grieve a lie while knowing the truth about what really happened. The guilt ate her alive, but she was too terrified to speak up because she knew whoever killed your wife would come for her next." Harold looked at the pendant around Sophia's neck with new understanding. It wasn't just a stolen heirloom. It was evidence his wife had died protecting, a secret she'd entrusted to a woman who'd paid the ultimate price for her silence. "We have to find out what Margaret discovered," Harold said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "Whatever she died trying to expose, we're going to finish what she started." But as they stood in that sterile hospital corridor, none of them realized they were being watched by someone who'd been waiting 30 years for this moment to arrive. The rain hammered against the windows of Harold's private study as he sat surrounded by 30 years of carefully organized business documents. Sophia occupied the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. Elena's letter spread between them like a road map to buried secrets. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed midnight, its deep tones echoing through the penthouse that suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a home. "Margaret's appointment book," Harold said, his voice hoarse from hours of searching through boxes he'd sealed away after her death. "She kept meticulous records of everything: charity meetings, shopping trips, dinner plans. But look at this." Sophia leaned forward as Harold pointed to an entry dated the morning Margaret died. In her elegant handwriting were the words, "Meeting RC, urgent. Cannot trust anyone else with this." "RC," Sophia whispered. "Who is RC?" Harold's blood ran cold as the initials registered. "Robert Castellano, my business partner for over 20 years. He was like a brother to me, stood beside me at Margaret's funeral, helped me through the darkest period of my life. The implications crashed over him like a tsunami. If Margaret had been meeting with Robert about something urgent enough to risk her life, then either Robert was part of whatever conspiracy she'd uncovered, or he'd been the one she'd trusted with her suspicions. "We need to find him," Sophia said, her voice carrying a steel that reminded Harold painfully of Margaret's determination when she'd set her mind to something. "That might be more difficult than you think," Harold replied, pulling out a newspaper clipping from the following year. "Robert died in a boating accident 8 months after Margaret's funeral. His yacht exploded in the harbor. They never found his body." Sophia's face paled as the pattern became sickeningly clear. 2 people die within a year, both in accidents, both connected to whatever Margaret discovered. This isn't coincidence. Harold stood abruptly, pacing to the window where the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked glass. "I built Blackstone Industries from nothing, Sophia. Every deal, every contract, every expansion. I thought I knew where every dollar came from. But what if I was being used as a front for something darker? What kind of business were you in back then?" Sophia asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be comforting. "Real estate development, primarily. We specialized in revitalizing abandoned urban areas, turning derelict buildings into luxury developments. The city loved us because we were cleaning up problem neighborhoods. The profits were enormous because we could buy properties for almost nothing." Sophia's silence stretched uncomfortably as Harold continued, the pieces falling together in his mind with devastating clarity. The property acquisitions were always handled by Robert's side of the business. He had connections with city officials, could navigate the bureaucracy faster than anyone I'd ever seen. "Harold," Sophia said quietly, "what if those properties weren't acquired legally? What if Robert was forcing people out of their homes, using intimidation or worse to get those rock-bottom prices? The possibility hit Harold like a physical blow. He'd been so focused on the construction and design phases of their projects that he'd rarely questioned Robert's methods for acquiring land. He'd trusted his partner completely, had signed documents without reading them, had celebrated their success without examining its foundation. Margaret was always asking questions about our business, Harold remembered, his voice growing hollow. She wanted to know about the families who'd lived in the buildings we demolished, worried about gentrification displacing long-term residents. I told her not to concern herself with business matters. Sophia stood and moved to stand beside him at the window. What if she didn't listen? What if she started investigating on her own? Harold pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through contacts he hadn't called in years. Detective James Morrison. He worked Margaret's case. If there was evidence of foul play, he would have found it. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Morrison. Detective Morrison, this is Harold Blackstone. You investigated my wife's death 30 years ago. A long pause. Mr. Blackstone, I wondered if you'd ever call. What can I do for you? I need to know if there was anything about Margaret's case that bothered you. Anything that didn't add up but couldn't be proven. Another pause, longer this time. Mr. Blackstone, are you somewhere we can meet privately? This isn't a conversation for the phone. The urgency in Morrison's voice sent chills down Harold's spine. You can come to my penthouse. We'll be waiting. We? Harold looked at Sophia, seeing in her eyes the same determination that had driven Margaret to seek the truth, regardless of the cost. I'm not alone in this anymore. Good, Morrison replied. You're going to need allies for what I have to tell you. I'll be there within the hour. As Harold ended the call, Sophia moved closer to the desk where Margaret's appointment book lay open. Harold, look at this. The week before she died, Margaret made note of visiting 3 different properties your company had acquired. She wrote down addresses and what looks like names of former residents. Harold studied his wife's handwriting, recognizing the careful way she documented information when she was building a case for one of her charity initiatives. But this wasn't about fundraising. This was an investigation. The Riverside Gardens project, Harold breathed, recognizing one of the addresses. That was Robert's crown jewel, a 100-unit luxury complex built on the site of an old apartment building. The profits from that single project funded our expansion into international markets. What happened to the people who lived in the original building? Sophia asked, though her expression suggested she feared the answer. Harold's mouth went dry as suppressed memories began surfacing. There had been protests, he remembered now. Elderly residents who'd claimed they were being forced out illegally. Families who'd lived in the building for generations suddenly facing eviction. Robert had handled all of it, had assured Harold that everything was being done according to legal procedures. There was an old man, Harold whispered, the memory hitting him like a sledgehammer. Giuseppe Martinez. He came to my office begging me to reconsider the demolition. Said his family had lived in that building for 40 years, that Robert's people had threatened them. Sophia's sharp intake of breath made Harold turn. She was staring at him with an expression of dawning horror. Martinez, she whispered. That was my grandfather's name. Giuseppe Martinez was my mother's father. The room seemed to spin as Harold realized the full scope of the tragedy that had connected their lives. Margaret hadn't just discovered Robert's illegal activities. She'd uncovered the systematic destruction of families like Sophia's, the deliberate targeting of vulnerable residents who couldn't fight back against wealthy developers. Your mother wasn't just a witness to Margaret's murder, Harold said, his voice breaking. She was one of the victims Margaret died trying to protect. Detective Morrison arrived exactly 1 hour later, his weathered face bearing the weight of 3 decades of unsolved cases and buried truths. Harold barely recognized the man who'd once stood in his living room delivering the devastating news of Margaret's death. The confident officer had been replaced by someone whose eyes held the haunted look of a man carrying secrets too dangerous to share. Before we begin, Morrison said, settling into the chair Sophia vacated for him, I need you both to understand something. What I'm about to tell you cost me my career and nearly cost me my life. There are people who would prefer this information never see daylight. Sophia remained standing, her arms crossed protectively over her chest, the pendant catching the lamplight like a beacon of the truth they were finally approaching. Detective, My mother died believing she was protecting a secret that could destroy lives. We're past worrying about danger. Morrison studied her face with the sharp assessment of someone trained to read people. You have your mother's eyes. Elena Martinez was a brave woman who found herself caught in something much bigger than she understood. Harold's head snapped up. You knew Elena? She came to see me 2 weeks after your wife's death, Morrison replied, his voice heavy with regret. Scared out of her mind, clutching a tape recorder and begging me to listen to something that would make everything clear. But before she could play it, my captain pulled me off the case and transferred me to traffic duty. The room fell silent, except for the persistent drumming of rain against the windows. Harold felt the walls of his carefully constructed world continuing to crumble as Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew a small digital recorder, modern technology that looked starkly out of place in his weathered hands. I kept this for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to surface. Elena managed to slip it to me before my captain escorted her out of the building. She never got the chance to tell me what was on it. Sophia's voice was barely a whisper. You've never listened to it? Morrison's smile was grim. Oh, I listened to it. Once. Then I understood why my captain was so eager to shut down any investigation into your wife's death, Mr. Blackstone. This recording doesn't just reveal who killed Margaret. It exposes a network of corruption that reaches into the highest levels of city government. Harold's hands trembled as Morrison placed the recorder on the desk between them. 30 years of grief, 30 years of believing his wife had died in a senseless accident, had led to this moment. Whatever was on that tape would either vindicate Margaret's sacrifice or destroy everything Harold had built in her memory. The recording was made the day Margaret died, Morrison continued. Elena had given Margaret a small tape recorder disguised as a jewelry box, something they'd arranged during their previous meetings. Margaret was supposed to record her conversation with Robert Castellano as evidence of the illegal property acquisitions. Sophia moved closer to Harold, her presence offering comfort he hadn't realized he desperately needed. What did she discover? Morrison pressed play, and suddenly Margaret's voice filled the room, clear, determined, and heartbreakingly alive. Harold gripped the arms of his chair as his wife's words reached across 3 decades to finally tell her story. Robert, I know what you've been doing, Margaret's voice said through the static. The families you've displaced, the bribes you've paid to city officials, the threats made against people who wouldn't sell their homes. Harold doesn't know, does he? Robert's voice was barely audible, muffled as if he were standing farther from the recording device. Margaret, you don't understand the complexities of business. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. The greater good? Margaret's voice rose with righteous anger. Giuseppe Martinez lost his home because you had thugs threaten his granddaughter. The Riverside Gardens project displaced 200 families, most of them elderly or disabled people who had nowhere else to go. Harold felt bile rise in his throat as he heard Robert's cold response. Those people were holding back progress. The neighborhood needed revitalization, and Harold's vision made that possible. He'll never need to know the details of how we acquired the properties. But I know, Margaret said, her voice steel-strong despite the obvious fear. And I have documentation of everything. The bribes, the intimidation, the falsified eviction notices. Mayor Davidson, Commissioner Wells, half the city planning board. They're all part of this. Sophia's sharp intake of breath cut through the recording as a new voice joined the conversation, one that made Harold's blood freeze in his veins. I'm afraid that knowledge makes you a liability, Mrs. Blackstone. The voice belonged to Commissioner Wells, a man Harold had considered a friend, someone who'd attended Margaret's funeral and offered his condolences with what had seemed like genuine grief. Margaret, run! Robert's voice suddenly cut through, panic replacing his earlier coldness. This wasn't supposed to happen. I never agreed to this. The sound of struggle filled the recording, chairs scraping, Margaret's voice crying out, the crash of something heavy falling. Harold realized he was holding his breath as the awful sounds continued, painting a picture of violence he'd never imagined his gentle wife enduring. Make it look like an accident, Wells' voice commanded. Her car is parked 3 blocks away. Brake line failure on a rainy day. Tragic, but believable. Morrison stopped the recording, the silence that followed more devastating than the sounds of violence had been. Harold stared at the device as if it contained a venomous snake. unable to process the magnitude of betrayal he'd just witnessed. Commissioner Wells died of a heart attack 5 years later, Morrison said quietly. But Mayor Davidson is still alive, still active in city politics. He's now a federal judge, appointed to the circuit court 2 years ago. Sophia's voice cut through Harold's shock like a blade. This recording proves my mother was telling the truth. Margaret trusted Elena with evidence that could have brought down an entire criminal network. Elena tried to do the right thing, Morrison continued. But when she came to me, the corruption had already spread too deep. My captain, my sergeant, half the precinct, they were all either bought or intimidated into silence. Harold finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Robert tried to save her. At the end, he tried to warn Margaret to run. Robert Castellano's death wasn't an accident either, Morrison revealed. He was about to come forward, about to confess everything to federal authorities. Someone made sure he never got the chance. The weight of 30 years of injustice settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Margaret had died trying to protect innocent families. Elena had died carrying the burden of that secret. And Robert had died attempting to make amends for his role in the conspiracy. "What do we do now?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the same determination that had driven her mother to protect Margaret's final gift. Harold looked at the pendant around Sophia's neck, understanding finally that it represented more than just evidence. It was a symbol of every life that had been destroyed by his unknowing complicity in Robert's crimes. "We finish what Margaret started," Harold said, his voice growing stronger with resolve. "We expose everyone who was part of this conspiracy, no matter how powerful they've become." But as Morrison rewound the tape, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past hour, or the telephoto lens aimed at Harold's window. The black sedan had been following them for 6 blocks through the empty midnight streets, its headlights maintaining a careful distance that screamed professional surveillance. Harold gripped the steering wheel of his Bentley as Detective Morrison sat in the passenger seat, constantly checking the side mirrors with the paranoia of a man who'd spent 30 years looking over his shoulder. "They know we have the recording," Morrison said grimly. "I should have anticipated this. The moment I walked into your building tonight, I probably triggered every alarm bell in their network." Sophia leaned forward from the back seat, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Who exactly is they? Commissioner Wells is dead. Robert is dead. Who's left to protect this conspiracy?" Harold took a sharp right turn, testing whether their tail would follow. The sedan matched their movement perfectly, confirming Morrison's suspicions. "Judge Davidson has had 30 years to build new alliances, to bring fresh people into his circle. Corruption doesn't die with the original conspirators. It evolves." Morrison's phone buzzed with an incoming text. He glanced at it, and his face went ashen. "We need to get off the street immediately. My contact at the FBI just sent a warning. There's been chatter about cleaning up loose ends related to an old Blackstone Industries case." "Where can we go?" Sophia asked, unconsciously touching the pendant that had started their deadly journey toward the truth. "If they've been watching Harold's building, they probably know about his other properties too." Harold's mind raced through possibilities as he navigated the darkened city streets. Hotels would require identification. Friends' homes would put innocent people at risk, and his office building was definitely compromised. Then a memory surfaced, something Margaret had mentioned years ago about Elena's living situation. "Sophia, where did your mother live when she worked for my company?" Her original address before she got sick. A small apartment above her cousin's bakery in Little Italy. "Maria's Pastries on Mulberry Street, but Maria died years ago, and the building has been empty since then." "Empty buildings are perfect for people who need to disappear temporarily," Morrison interjected. "Do you still have access?" Sophia nodded slowly. "Maria left me the keys. She said the apartment held too many memories of my mother for her to rent it out. I've been paying the utilities to keep it maintained, thinking someday I might—" Her voice trailed off. Harold made another series of turns, weaving through narrow streets until he was confident they'd lost their tail. The abandoned bakery sat in darkness between a closed laundromat and a 24-hour bodega, its faded awning a ghost of more prosperous times. "Before we go up," Morrison said as they parked in the alley behind the building, "there's something else I need to tell you about that hospital visit. The man who came to see Elena in her final days. I know who he was." Harold and Sophia turned to stare at the detective, who looked like he was preparing to deliver another devastating blow. Thomas Caldwell. He was Robert Castellano's personal attorney, the man who handled all the legal paperwork for your property acquisitions. When Elena described him to Nurse Patricia, I recognized the description immediately. The name hit Harold like a physical assault. Thomas Caldwell had been at Margaret's funeral, had helped Harold navigate the legal complexities of her estate, had been a trusted advisor for decades. The betrayal felt like losing Robert all over again. "Thomas is still alive," Harold whispered, the implications crashing over him. "He's been practicing law this entire time, still handling real estate deals throughout the city." "More than that," Morrison continued as Sophia unlocked the building's rear entrance. "He's now the head of the city's legal department, directly appointed by Judge Davidson. They've managed to position themselves to control any investigation that might threaten their interests." They climbed the narrow stairs to Elena's former apartment, each step creaking under their weight like a countdown to revelation. Sophia's hands shook as she opened the door to reveal a space frozen in time. Furniture covered in dusty sheets, family photographs still hanging on faded wallpaper, the lingering scent of the bread that had once been baked in the shop below. "She lived here for 15 years, Sophia said softly, moving to uncover a small dining table where Elena's sewing machine still sat. "After my grandfather Giuseppe lost his home in the Riverside Gardens demolition, she brought him here to live with us. He died just months before she got sick." Harold felt the weight of his unknowing complicity crushing down on him as he realized Giuseppe Martinez had spent his final years in this tiny apartment, displaced from his family home by Harold's company's greed. Morrison moved to the window, keeping watch on the street below, while Sophia began searching through her mother's belongings with purpose. "She told me she'd hidden something important here," Sophia explained, kneeling beside an old cedar chest. "Said that if anything ever happened to her, I should look for the guardian angels she'd kept safe." Inside the chest, beneath layers of carefully preserved photographs and letters, Sophia found a manila envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed with age. Her name was written across it in Elena's handwriting, along with the words, "For when the truth finally comes home." "What's inside?" Harold asked, though part of him dreaded another revelation that would further shatter his understanding of the past. Sophia opened the envelope with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of documents that made Morrison whistle low under his breath. Bank statements, property deeds, signed confessions, and most damning of all, a series of photographs showing Robert Castellano meeting with various city officials in locations that suggested secrecy and illegal activity. "Elena documented everything," Sophia breathed. "She must have been investigating the conspiracy for months before Margaret's death." Harold picked up one of the photographs, recognizing the distinctive architecture of City Hall's basement archives, a place where sensitive documents were stored away from public access. Robert was handing a thick envelope to Judge Davidson, who was still Mayor Davidson at the time. She was Margaret's secret ally, Harold realized. Elena wasn't just a witness to what happened. She was actively helping Margaret gather evidence against the conspiracy. Morrison examined the documents with the trained eye of someone who'd spent decades building criminal cases. These bank statements show payments from offshore accounts directly to city officials.
The amounts correspond exactly to the dates when problematic property sales were approved. "But how did Elena access this information?" Sophia asked. "She was a housekeeper, not an investigator." Harold felt another piece of the puzzle click into place as he remembered Elena's work schedule. She cleaned the city offices too, late-night shifts when all the officials had gone home.
She would have had access to unlocked computers, unsecured documents, private conversations on answering machines. "The guardian angels," Sophia whispered, understanding finally dawning. She called these documents guardian angels because she believed they would protect innocent families from being displaced in the future. Morrison's phone buzzed again, this time with an urgent call. He listened briefly before hanging up with a grim expression. "The FBI contact I mentioned? They've just discovered something that changes everything. Judge Davidson didn't just profit from the original conspiracy. He's been running a similar operation for the past decade, using his judicial position to facilitate illegal property seizures on a massive scale." Harold sank into Elena's old rocking chair, overwhelmed by the scope of corruption that his business success had unknowingly facilitated. "How many families have suffered because I was too naive to question Robert's methods?" That's not the question that matters now, Sophia said firmly, gathering the evidence into a secure pile. The question is how many more families we can save by exposing this network before they destroy more lives. Morrison moved away from the window with sudden urgency. We need to leave. Now. There are 3 cars positioning themselves around the building, and I don't think they're here to deliver pizza. As they quickly gathered Elena's evidence, Harold realized that the pendant around Sophia's neck had never just been Margaret's necklace. It had been a symbol of resistance, a talisman carried by 2 brave women who'd risked everything to protect the innocent. Elena never told you the complete truth about that necklace, Harold said as they prepared to escape through the building's rear exit. When Margaret gave it to her that final day, she wasn't just asking Elena to keep it safe. She was passing the responsibility for exposing this conspiracy to the only person she trusted completely. Sophia's eyes filled with tears as she understood the full weight of her mother's sacrifice. Elena Martinez hadn't just been a victim of circumstances. She'd been a guardian angel herself, protecting the truth until the day when her daughter could carry the fight forward. But as they descended the darkened staircase, the sound of footsteps in the alley below told them their enemies had finally found them. The footsteps in the alley grew louder as Harold, Sophia, and Morrison found themselves trapped between the approaching danger below and the 3 stories of empty building above them. Morrison drew his service weapon, a habit that had kept him alive through 30 years of dangerous situations, while Sophia clutched Elena's evidence against her chest like a shield of truth. The roof, Harold whispered, remembering the connected buildings from his youth spent exploring this neighborhood. These old tenements share fire escapes. We can cross to the bodega and exit through their front door. They climbed in darkness, each creak of the ancient stairs echoing like gunshots in the silence. Behind them, voices filtered up from Elena's apartment as their pursuers discovered the open evidence chest and realized what had been taken. "Spread out," a commanding voice ordered. "They can't have gone far with those documents. Judge Davidson wants this contained before sunrise." On the roof, the city sprawled before them like a constellation of possibilities and broken dreams. Harold helped Sophia across the gap between buildings, her mother's evidence secured in Morrison's weatherproof evidence bag. As they reached the bodega's fire escape, Sophia suddenly stopped. "Wait," she said, her voice carrying a determination that reminded Harold achingly of Margaret. "Running isn't enough anymore. These people have been destroying lives for 30 years because they've operated in shadows and silence. It's time to bring this into the light." Morrison looked at her as if she'd suggested jumping off the roof. "Sophia, these aren't ordinary criminals. They have resources, connections, the ability to make people disappear permanently." "They made my mother disappear into silence and fear," Sophia replied, touching the pendant that had started their journey. "They made Margaret disappear into a lie that Harold carried for 3 decades. But they can't make the truth disappear if enough people know it." Harold understood immediately what she was proposing. "Live television. The morning news programs start broadcasting in 3 hours. If we can get Elena's evidence to Channel 7, their investigative team could break the story before Davidson's people can suppress it. Channel 7's studios are 15 blocks away," Morrison calculated. "Davidson's people will have the entire route watched by now." Sophia smiled, and for the first time since Harold had met her, the expression carried hope instead of exhaustion. "Then we don't go to the studio. We bring the studio to us." Within an hour, Sophia had contacted investigative reporter Rebecca Torres, whose exposés on city corruption had won 2 Pulitzer Prizes and earned her a reputation for protecting sources at any cost. Rebecca agreed to meet them at the one place Davidson's people couldn't control, the steps of federal court, where sunrise would bring cameras, crowds, and the kind of public attention that made violence impossible. As dawn broke over the city, Harold stood beside Sophia on those marble steps, Elena's evidence laid out before a growing crowd of reporters, federal agents, and citizens who'd been awakened by emergency broadcasts, promising revelations that would shake the foundations of city government. 30 years ago, Sophia began, her voice carrying clearly through the portable microphones thrust toward her. "My mother, Elena Martinez, made a promise to a dying woman named Margaret Blackstone. Today, I'm keeping that promise." Harold watched as Sophia told their story with an eloquence that would have made both Elena and Margaret proud. She spoke of families displaced by greed, of evidence hidden by fear, of brave women who'd paid the ultimate price for refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. When she finished, Harold stepped forward, removing a document from his jacket that he'd prepared during their sleepless night. "I'm Harold Blackstone," he said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do. "Everything Sophia has told you is true, and I bear responsibility for my unknowing part in these crimes. Today, I'm announcing the immediate dissolution of Blackstone Industries and the establishment of the Margaret Eleanor Foundation." The crowd stirred as Harold continued. "Every asset, every property, every dollar I've earned will be dedicated to compensating the families harmed by our illegal activities and ensuring that affordable housing replaces the luxury developments built on their suffering." Rebecca Torres stepped forward, her camera crew capturing every word. "Mr. Blackstone, you're essentially giving away $1 billion empire." "Why?" Harold looked at Sophia, seeing in her eyes the same fierce justice that had driven Margaret to sacrifice her life for strangers she'd never met. "Because money earned through the suffering of innocent people isn't wealth. It's a debt, and it's time the debt was paid." The federal agents who'd been waiting in the crowd moved forward as Harold handed over Elena's evidence. Within hours, arrest warrants were issued for Judge Davidson, Thomas Caldwell, and 17 other officials whose corruption had been meticulously documented by two women who'd never lived to see justice served. 6 months later, Harold stood in the community garden that had been built on the site of the original Riverside Gardens development. Sophia worked beside him, planting tomatoes where luxury condos had once blocked out the sun. The Margaret Eleanor Foundation had purchased the property from the city for $1, converting it into affordable housing and green space for the neighborhood Elena's family had called home. "She would have loved this," Sophia said, brushing soil from her hands as children played in the playground that bore Elena's name. "My mother always said gardens were proof that beautiful things could grow from broken ground." Harold nodded, watching Giuseppe Martinez's great-grandchildren, Sophia's nieces and nephews, chase butterflies through the vegetable rows their ancestor would never see, but had somehow helped make possible. "Margaret used to say something similar," Harold replied. "She believed that redemption wasn't about erasing past mistakes, but about planting seeds for a better future." The pendant still hung around Sophia's neck, catching the afternoon sunlight as she knelt to tend the memorial roses planted in honor of all the families who'd been displaced, but not forgotten. The necklace had completed its journey from symbol of love to evidence of corruption to beacon of justice, finally resting where it belonged, with someone who understood that true treasure isn't what we accumulate, but what we give away. As the sun set over the garden, Harold realized that he'd finally found what he'd been searching for since Margaret's death. Not the fortune that had never brought him peace, not the success that had cost him his soul, but the simple satisfaction of work that honored rather than exploited, built up rather than tore down, remembered rather than erased. The golden pendant gleamed one final time in the dying light, a silent testament to the truth that love, justice, and redemption are the only treasures that multiply when shared, the only wealth that grows richer when given away, and the only legacy that truly matters when all accounts are finally settled. In the end, Margaret and Elena's sacrifice had not been in vain. Their courage had planted seeds of justice that would bloom for generations, proving that even in the darkest soil of human greed and corruption, the seeds of redemption can still take root and flourish.